Ruth Coleman wasn't even back from the cemetery when her daughter changed the locks on the house Ruth had lived in for 43 years. The funeral reception was still going, mourners quietly eating sandwiches in the church basement, when Claire's husband drove to the hardware store, bought new deadbolts, and installed them before the sun went down. Ruth discovered this 3 hours later when her key wouldn't turn in the front door of her own home, and her daughter answered wearing an expression that said the decision had already been made, discussed, and finalized without her. "This isn't your house anymore, Mom," Claire said through the 6-inch gap allowed by the chain lock. "Dad left it to me." The lawyer confirmed it this morning. Ruth stood on the porch she had swept 10,000 times, staring at her only child as if looking at a stranger. "Your father died yesterday, and his will was very clear." Claire's voice carried no grief, no hesitation, just cold efficiency. "You can stay at a hotel tonight. We'll talk about your things later." The door closed. The lock clicked. And Ruth Coleman, 74 years old and still wearing her funeral dress, stood alone on the front step as the porch light went dark above her. But what Claire didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Ruth's husband had built something into that house years ago, something hidden so carefully that even he had almost forgotten about it. And the moment Claire changed those locks, she set into motion a discovery that would prove she had locked out the one person who actually held the key to everything that mattered. The marriage had been quiet for a long time. Not angry, not broken, just distant. Harold Coleman was a man of routines and silence, someone who expressed affection through small repairs rather than words, who showed up every day but rarely seemed fully present. For decades, Ruth had accepted this as simply who he was, the steady, dependable man who fixed the gutters and paid the bills on time, but never quite looked her in the eye anymore. She had loved him once, deeply, back when they were young and he still smiled at her across rooms. But somewhere in the long middle years of raising Claire, managing the household, and watching Harold retreat further into his workshop in the basement, that love had settled into something more like companionship. They existed together. They were polite. They no longer fought because they no longer expected anything worth fighting for. When the stroke took him, it happened in the garage while he was organizing his tools. Ruth found him there an hour later, already gone, his hand still resting on a wrench as if he had simply paused mid-task. The shock of it left her numb, not with devastating grief, but with a strange, guilty sense of relief that surprised her. Because now, at least, the waiting was over. The pretending could stop. Claire arrived from across town within an hour of the call, her face composed, her movements efficient. She handled the funeral arrangements with the same brisk control she applied to everything else in her life. Choosing the casket, writing the obituary, coordinating with the church. Ruth barely had to make a decision. In fact, Claire didn't seem to want her to. "I'll take care of it, Mom," she said repeatedly, in a tone that sounded helpful but felt like dismissal. It wasn't until the day before the funeral that Claire sat Ruth down at the kitchen table and slid a folder across the surface. "Dad's will," Claire said simply. "I had the lawyer send a copy." Ruth opened it slowly, scanning the pages she didn't fully understand, the legal language dense and unfamiliar. And then she saw it. The house, the savings, the small investment accounts, everything had been left to Claire. Ruth's name appeared only once, in a section about personal belongings she would be allowed to claim. Her breath caught. "I don't understand." Claire's expression didn't change. "Dad updated this 2 years ago. He wanted to make sure everything was handled properly." "Handled properly?" Ruth repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, I've lived here for over 40 years. And now it's time to think about what makes sense going forward." Claire's tone was measured, practiced. "You're 74, Mom. You can't manage a house this size alone. We'll find you a nice apartment, somewhere easier." Ruth stared at her daughter, searching for softness, for doubt, for any sign of the child she had raised. But Claire simply collected the folder and stood. "We'll talk more after the funeral," she said, and left the room. Now, standing outside the locked door, Ruth finally understood. This hadn't been about Harold's sudden death. This had been planned, prepared, executed the moment the opportunity arrived. She turned slowly and walked down the porch steps, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. She had no car. Harold's was already in Claire's driveway. She had $40 in her purse, and she had nowhere to go. But as she reached the sidewalk and looked back at the darkened house, One thought pushed through the shock. The closet in the back bedroom. The one Harold had rebuilt 5 years ago, working late into the night, insisting he didn't need help. The one with the wall that never quite sat flush. Ruth had noticed it once and asked him about it. He brushed her off, said it was just settling. But now, locked out of everything she thought was hers, she realized something that made her pulse quicken. Harold had been a man of silence and secrets, and not all of them had been left to Claire. Ruth spent that first night in a motel 6 miles outside town, a place with thin walls and a flickering neon sign that buzzed through the darkness. She sat on the edge of the bed still wearing her funeral dress, staring at the phone in her hand, trying to decide who to call. But the list was painfully short. Most of her friends had drifted away over the years, absorbed into their own families, their own problems. And the few who remained wouldn't understand what was happening, wouldn't believe that a daughter could do this to her own mother. By morning, Ruth had made a decision. She wasn't going to beg Claire for access to her own home. She wasn't going to plead or explain or try to appeal to compassion that clearly didn't exist. Instead, she was going to do something Claire hadn't anticipated. She was going to remember. Harold had worked in that back bedroom for 3 solid weeks 5 years ago, claiming he was reinforcing the closet structure. He'd brought in materials after Ruth had gone to bed, worked with the door closed, and refused her offers to help. At the time, she'd assumed he was just being stubborn, preferring solitude to conversation as he always did. But now, replaying those weeks in her mind, Ruth noticed details she'd dismissed before. The way he'd measured the closet depth twice, frowning at numbers that didn't match. The subtle change in the wall's position after he finished, pushed back just slightly, creating a space that felt smaller than it should have been. And the look on his face when she'd asked if everything was all right, a brief flicker of something that might have been guilt before he turned away. Harold had hidden something in that house. She was certain of it now. The question was how to get back inside. The answer came from an unexpected source. Ruth called Margaret Linden, a neighbor who'd lived 3 doors down for 20 years and had always been quietly kind. When Ruth explained she'd been locked out, Margaret didn't ask questions. She simply said, "Claire left an hour ago. Saw her drive off with her husband. House looks empty." Ruth's pulse quickened. "How long do you think I have?" "She had suitcases," Margaret said carefully. "Looked like they were going somewhere for a few days." 20 minutes later, Ruth stood in Margaret's kitchen, holding a spare key she'd given the neighbor years ago for emergencies. Harold had never known about it. He'd always been too private to approve of sharing keys. But Ruth had quietly made the copy anyway, a small act of practicality she'd never expected to need. Her hands shook as she held it now. "You sure about this?" Margaret asked gently. Ruth met her eyes. "It's my home." The house felt different when she stepped inside. Colder, emptier, as though Claire's presence had already begun erasing the life Ruth had built there. Furniture had been shifted. Papers were stacked in new piles. The kitchen counters had been cleared of the small items Ruth had always kept. Her favorite mug, the ceramic bowl for keys, the framed photo of her and Harold from 30 years ago. Ruth moved quickly through the rooms, her heart pounding as she reached the back bedroom. The door was closed. She opened it slowly, stepping into the space that had once been a guest room, but now stood mostly bare. The closet waited against the far wall. Ruth knelt in front of it, running her hands along the back panel the way she'd done once before, years ago, when something about it had felt wrong. The seam was there, faint but real, hidden cleverly beneath the paint but impossible to miss once you knew to look for it. She pressed gently along the edges, searching for the mechanism Harold must have installed. And then, near the bottom corner, her fingers found a small latch, recessed and nearly invisible. She pressed it. The panel clicked softly and swung inward, revealing a narrow door that opened into darkness. Ruth's breath caught. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight, and leaned forward. Shelves. And on those shelves were boxes, folders, and envelopes, all labeled in Harold's precise handwriting. Ruth stepped inside carefully, her hands trembling as she reached for the nearest folder. Inside were documents, property records, legal papers, account statements, all organized with the same meticulous care Harold had applied to everything in his life. But these weren't the accounts Claire had inherited. These were different. Ruth pulled out another folder, then another, her eyes widening as the scope of what she was seeing became clear. Harold had kept records of everything. investments made in Ruth's name decades ago, life insurance policies Claire didn't know existed, property deeds for land Ruth had never heard him mention. And in the center of the room, resting on a small table, was a sealed envelope with Ruth's name written across the front. She picked it up slowly, her heart pounding, and opened it. The letter inside was written in Harold's careful script, dated 2 years earlier, the same time he'd changed his will. "Ruth," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry I couldn't say this while I was still here. I was never good with words. But I need you to know that I didn't leave you with nothing." Ruth's vision blurred as she kept reading. "Claire doesn't know about this room. She doesn't know about the accounts I set up in your name, or the property I bought years ago when land was cheap. I kept it separate because I knew she'd try to take it if she could. I've watched her become someone I don't recognize, someone who sees you as a burden instead of her mother. And I couldn't let her have everything." Ruth's hands shook. "This is yours. All of it. The documents are legal. The accounts are protected. And the house, Claire can have the house. But she'll never have what matters, because that was always meant for you." The letter ended with a single line that broke something open inside Ruth's chest. "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for us, but I'm fighting for you now." Ruth stood in the hidden room, surrounded by the pieces of a life Harold had quietly protected. And for the first time since his death, she wept, not with grief, but with a complicated, overwhelming mixture of loss, anger, gratitude, and understanding. Because the man who had disappeared into silence for so many years had still been there, watching, planning, making sure that when everything fell apart, she wouldn't be left with nothing. And now, holding the proof of that in her hands, Ruth Coleman understood exactly what she needed to do next. Ruth worked quickly, methodically, the way Harold would have. She photographed every document in the hidden room, uploaded them to a secure cloud account, and carefully packed the most important papers into a bag she could carry. The property deeds, the account statements, the insurance policies, everything that proved what Harold had left her, separate from the will Claire had so confidently wielded. By the time she finished, 3 hours had passed. The house remained quiet, empty. But Ruth knew she couldn't stay. Claire would return eventually, and this confrontation needed to happen on Ruth's terms, not in the middle of a room where she could be thrown out again. She closed the hidden door carefully, making sure the panel locked back into place, erasing any evidence she'd been there. Then she walked out of the house, locked the door behind her with Margaret's spare key, and didn't look back. 2 days later, Ruth sat across from an attorney named David Brennan, a man in his 50s who listened without interrupting as she explained everything. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied the documents she'd laid on his desk. "These are legitimate," he said after a long pause. "Your husband set these accounts up legally, kept meticulous records, and ensured they stayed outside the estate covered by his will. So Claire can't touch them," Ruth said quietly. "She can't touch them," he confirmed. "The house, the savings he left her, those are hers. But this," he gestured to the papers, "this belongs entirely to you." Ruth felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just a quiet, steady certainty. "What do you want to do?" Brennan asked. Ruth considered the question carefully. She could fight Claire publicly, drag this in a court, force a confrontation that would burn whatever remained of their relationship to the ground. Or she could do something Harold would have understood better. She could walk away with dignity, carrying what mattered, and let Claire keep what she'd taken. "I want to make sure everything is protected," Ruth said. "And then I want to move on." 3 weeks later, Ruth signed a lease on a small, sunlit house on the other side of town. It wasn't large, but it was hers, paid for with funds from one of the accounts Harold had quietly built in her name. The furniture was new, chosen by her, arranged the way she wanted. And for the first time in decades, the space felt like it belonged to her, not to a marriage, not to a past she was trying to preserve, but to the life she was choosing now. Claire didn't call, didn't visit, didn't acknowledge the quiet shift that had occurred. But Ruth knew, through mutual acquaintances, that Claire had moved into the old house, had begun renovations, had settled in as though the transition of power had been inevitable and absolute. Let her have it, Ruth thought. Let her live in that house and never know what she missed. Because the property Harold had bought years ago, the land that had quietly appreciated in value over decades, was worth far more than the house itself. And the life insurance policy he'd kept separate, the one that named Ruth as the sole beneficiary, had already been paid out, providing a security she hadn't known existed until she found that hidden room. Harold had been a man of silence, but his silence had been deliberate, and in the end, he had spoken louder than Claire ever could. One afternoon, about 2 months after everything had settled, Ruth received a single piece of mail forwarded from the old address. It was a note from Claire, brief and impersonal, informing Ruth that she could arrange a time to pick up the rest of her belongings, clothing, books, a few pieces of furniture Claire didn't want. Ruth read it once and set it aside. She didn't need those things. Didn't want to walk back into that house and be reminded of everything that had been taken before she understood what she still held. Instead, she wrote a short reply. Claire, you can keep whatever's left. I've already taken what matters. Mom, she mailed it without hesitation and never heard back. Months passed. Ruth settled into her new life with a quietness that felt earned, not forced. She joined a community garden, started attending a local book club, reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with over the years. And slowly, carefully, she built something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, a life that belonged entirely to her. She thought about Harold sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a complicated gratitude. Their marriage hadn't been what she'd hoped for. He'd disappeared into himself, built walls she could never cross. But in the end, he'd seen her in a way Claire never had. He'd understood that she deserved more than being erased, more than being dismissed as inconvenient. And he'd made sure, in the only way he knew how, that she would be all right. One evening, as Ruth sat on her small porch watching the sunset, she thought about the hidden room behind the closet, still waiting in the house Claire now claimed as her own. She wondered if Claire would ever find it, ever discover the space her father had built to protect what mattered most. Probably not, Ruth decided, because finding it would require looking beyond the surface, beyond what seemed obvious and easy to take. It would require believing that someone quiet and unassuming might still have something valuable to protect. And Claire had never believed that about either of them. Ruth leaned back in her chair, feeling the evening breeze on her face, and allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Because in the end, Claire had changed the locks, moved into the house, and claimed everything she thought mattered. But she'd never found the door behind a closet. And she never would. That belonged to Ruth, along with everything else her daughter had assumed didn't exist.